Hello and welcome to the Idea Cast series of conversations and dialogues with academics, philosophers, artists, musicians, creative thinkers, and occasionally ordinary folks like myself who can relay extraordinary experience. The purpose of the Idea Cast series is to explore ideas that revolve around meaning, personal telos, healthy skepticism, fair skepticism, imagination, and a healthy and balanced sense of well-being and the pursuit of that well-being in each individual. So please join me as I find and engage with amazing and interesting people who have a valuable story to tell. And I will ask, instead of appealing to Patreon or other support mechanisms here on YouTube, that you go check out illuminelife.org. Give the landing page a review, see what you think. Pop on in for a free week trial. And if you have any questions at all about Illumine Life, you can email me. My email address is at the bottom of the landing page, and we can have a conversation. I can also be found on Facebook and Twitter, as well as Instagram, and I will leave the links to those platforms below. So thank you, and enjoy this next episode of IdeaCast. Hello, and welcome to the premiere episode of Illumine Life's IdeaCast series. And I'm really happy to be able to actualize this series. I've been planning to do this for a while, and I'm glad that this is finally coming into being. And the purpose of the IdeaCast series is to interview persons in multiple disciplines in academia, of science, specifically in psychology and neuroscience, cog-sci, philosophy, which is metaphysics, not necessarily science, and as well authors, musicians, and artists. So there's hopefully going to be a nice range of people that I'll be working with and having conversations with. My first guest is somebody that I'm deeply grateful to not only have a dialogue with, but also to be the first guest on the IdeaCast series. I'm really happy that I was able to set this up with Teri Dillion. And I've known Teri for 2 years, and I met her at a conference, and I've been following her story for the last couple of years. And back in November of 2020, she published her first book, No Pressure, No Diamonds. It is available on Amazon. I would highly recommend that you go to the page on Amazon. You just write No Pressure, No Diamonds in, get the book page pulled up, and read the synopsis, read the reviews, see what you think. If my word is worth anything to you, I would highly recommend that you get this book. It is not only a book of insight into the neurodegenerative condition of ALS, but it's also just a beautiful journey of one person, one young woman who is looking forward and backward, and it's discovering things about the nature of being, the hexaity of being human, and it's just a very touching story. It's a bittersweet story. It is certainly not one of those feel-good, happy ending stories, but that resonates with me because life lived at its most authentic and real expression carries this potential for things to not go well for persons. And so I think that is a deeply therapeutic and essential part of the human experience, is to explore every life experience with the same sort of eagerness and enthusiasm and curiosity. And this book provides a beautiful story about a person going through what is very much a harrowing experience. And so I'll leave it there. I will give you a brief introduction to who Teri Dillion is and then we will get into the interview. This interview will be conducted with Teri's computer voice. It was pre-recorded, and in the second half of the interview, I am going to be speaking live in Zoom. It'll be recorded and presented on YouTube in that manner, but I will be having a real-time conversation with John, her partner, in Zoom in the second half of this dialogue. So stay tuned. It's going to be a great interview, great dialogue, a great discussion about a simply amazing book. And let's get going. Like I said, I'll give you a quick little insight into who Teri is, and then we'll get underway. And thank you so much for being here. Teri Dillion is now retired from her career as a licensed psychotherapist, licensed addictions counselor, clinical supervisor, teacher, and meditation instructor. As an award-winning group process leader, she taught large group process in Naropa University's Contemplative Psychotherapy program and has been presented at regional conferences on group dynamics and leadership. Teri, welcome to the Idea Cast. I'm really glad to have you on board, and I'm looking forward to a really great dialogue with you today.
Thanks, Justin, for this opportunity to talk with you in this way. I'm hoping we have some fun today.
In your book, you mentioned a parent who may not have been able to connect, heal, or otherwise allow for proper closure. What would you say to people listening to this interview who are facing either side of a seeming intractable or estranged family dynamic? Is there a need for closure or connection for the sake of both parties, or do some things just need to pass as they are? Some spiritual people put emphasis on closure, but not all persons are gifted with the ability or circumstances to even establish meaningful communication with a familial counterpart or family member.
Well, geez, Justin, this is normally the point where I'd insert a joke about you hitting me with $1,000 question right out of the gate. But since my computer voice makes my humor even more dry than normal, I'll have to settle for saying, wow, what a delicate question to try to answer, and hope our listeners can trust the light-hearted tone I wish to bring to it. First, it feels important to acknowledge this question of conflict has special relevance right now, as many of us find ourselves in increasingly unbridgeable divides with people who we may once have disagreed with, but still felt a baseline of tolerance and respect for. It can't even be called merely a political divide anymore. It's more like we are operating in completely different realities from many of our family and neighbors, and the stakes and implications feel, and in some respects truly are, incredibly high. I wish I had meaningful answers for how to deal with this on a personal level, but I'm muddling my way through it day by day like everyone else. I can admit that this year I've chosen to carve some family members and friends out of my life completely who have developed, or more likely, exposed, especially noxious narratives about power, race, and rights and freedom. Others I choose to try to give the benefit of doubt to and accept as is, one day at a time, because I can't abide complete estrangement, and I hope they come around eventually. Either way, it's a painful situation. In general though, I think there's two separate issues with this question of conflict repair and closure in our important relationships. I've found there's the outer relationship with the person, and then the inner relationship we have with our understanding of and attitude towards them. Sometimes we can really only meaningfully address the latter since by necessity, not all relationships have room for the outer resolution and connection. People die, or physically disappear, or lose their cognitive abilities which would allow for closure. Sometimes they simply aren't willing or able to do the emotional work of repair for any number of reasons. Maybe our own boundaries and sense of sanity no longer allow us to engage people who have reliably harmful beliefs and behavior. While it's a gift if we have the circumstances to have meaningful repair with someone before it's too late, it's simply not always possible. It's funny, I thought for a long time that I needed that explicit, outer resolution with the individuals I was estranged from or conflicted with. As many of us were, I was trained early on to believe that any time I had conflict with anyone, on some level it was my fault, my responsibility to fix, and I simply needed to compromise more, rearrange myself more, and forgive more. This is also a commonly implied narrative in New Age circles that focus only on love and light. But of course, in reality, some relationships are just unhealthy and need to end, or at least need wide and healthy boundaries set up around them. Nothing good ever comes of abandoning ourselves for the sake of keeping the peace. At that point the question becomes how we relate with the person in our own mind and heart. Usually we need to first give ourselves permission to grieve the hurt, pain, and disappointment left behind from the relationship. In my experience, this grieving will be an ongoing process which we may dance with for a long time, especially if the person was an important figure like a parent, sibling, spouse or close friend. There's a lot of focus on forgiveness in spiritual teachings, which itself is a real mixed bag. I've found it helpful to learn to distinguish between the kind of forgiveness meant to absolve another person of wrongdoing, which might be premature or even unwise, and the forgiveness designed only to free our own hearts of painful resentments. For me, the best promise of forgiveness comes through being able to take a huge step backward to see the big picture, the soil from which we all sprout, so to speak. It's true that hurt people, and each one of us is a work in progress. We all carry forward the compulsions and roles of our early family dynamics, the wounds of our ancestors, and the shadows of our cultures. That is, we carry them forward until we have the motivation and tools to heal harmful patterns, get bravely honest, and embrace new stories for how to live and relate. Not everyone has that motivation. And speaking specifically of family dynamics, I should admit I'm not someone who believes love cannot coexist with abuse. I know this is a blasphemous line of thinking to many people, but I believe abusive behavior often springs from a lack of emotional skills and coping skills, as opposed to a straightforward sadism. For example, so often parents who abuse or neglect their children are doing so because they don't yet have awareness of better parenting options, or access to the help they need to better support their children, or are acting out an addiction they can't control. They are simply doing what they know to do, and are doing the best that they can with whatever ego strength and resources they have at the time, even if their best is totally awful and damaging. Of course, we should never excuse inexcusable behavior or deny actual harms. But as adults, we can try to distinguish between the well-meaning person, who we may love, from the alcoholism, patterns of abuse, or whatever other illness they carry, which we may rightly hate. So when we're looking for inner peace, I believe it can be found whether or not we have the repair we want with the other person. And I think having this outlook really helps with forgiveness efforts, or at the very least with building a relieving perspective. We can then work to become the loving parent, sibling, and best friend to ourselves that we most wanted. It's funny, though, because on a personal level I often find that only after I've let go of my need for someone else to change, do the dynamics of the relationship have the necessary space to truly shift. Acceptance of wherever the other person is at, and deciding to detach with love, can be a powerful step. When we're doing our own work to retract our projections and expectations of others, others can have a funny way of surprising us with different behaviors. This is the kind of paradoxical wisdom offered by mutual aid groups like Al-Anon. It's easy to focus on the activity of the other, whether they are active in an addiction or some other destructive behavior or emotional state. But when we take the time to really investigate our own behaviors and judgments and expectations of others, we often come to see how we're adding to our own misery with our solid narratives or investment, thereby keeping the relationships in question in a stalemate. And once we see that, we are naturally empowered to create a healthier dynamic, which may or may not include saying goodbye to the relationship. I hope my current thinking on this did some justice to your question.
As a therapist who is, in this interview, possibly addressing therapists for years to come, would you be able to offer some coarse-grained insight on how to be available or best assist persons with ALS or other neurodegenerative conditions?
Well, I'll answer this specifically for therapists, but much of what I'm about to say here will be applicable to caregivers, friends, and helpers, to anyone dealing with a serious illness, or who are otherwise facing extraordinarily difficult personal circumstances. I think in general, doing a little research about the specifics of a given disease or challenge is helpful for relating to someone who is shouldering it. For example, neurological illnesses in particular have such wide-ranging manifestations, and may include organic impacts on mood or cognition which could affect how someone shows up in relationship. One thing many of us across the spectrum of neurological injury present with is something called pseudobulbar affect. This is a kind of emotional incontinence where we may start laughing or crying for no clear reason. My tendency to laugh at bad news still to this day confuses the people around me. It'd be important for a therapist or helper to know there's a neurological reason for it, not so much an emotional one. More generally, for anyone in a professional helper role, or even just coming in as a friend, don't be afraid to be flexible with how to adapt what you can offer. My own therapist taught me a lot during this time. As a therapist myself, and as a client, I was always very formal in observing old-school boundaries to the relationship. I never would have dreamed of calling my therapist outside of our scheduled time, for example, or asking for special accommodations. It was my relative privilege that allowed me to skate by and play by the quote, rules. But suddenly I get this unbelievable diagnosis, and my physical ability is steadily declining, and all my rules and aspirations for being a good and easy client fly out the window. My therapist was soon accepting calls from me post-diagnosis when I was melting down, reminding me to breathe. One time she helped me start my car after a session when suddenly, because of my quickly progressing disability, I lost the requisite grip to turn the key. And now, we do our sessions through Zoom like everybody else in the pandemic, yet to save time I only type into the chat bar instead of use my computer voice. Since I no longer have an income besides disability, she also takes a reduced fee from me. All of this is of course more effort for her, with less profit, but has made the work doable for me, and for that I'm so grateful. She's really embodying the spirit of accommodations, by which I mean, expanding access to a service or experience which is typically designed only for people within a certain narrow window of privilege. I imagine this glimpse inside my life helps her find more gratitude and perspective, which could influence how she treats other clients, or relates to her own life. That's my fantasy, at least. Speaking broadly, it's helpful to know the basic physical, emotional, financial, and spiritual stresses facing the families of people affected with serious illness, or at least be good at asking great, open-ended questions on these topics. Illness has a way of making relationships complicated, and usually there are logistical challenges which intersect and overlap with relational and financial ones. And it's always going to be helpful to look at the strengths and supports as well as the challenges, like the kind neighbors, beloved pets, extended family, community programs, faith community, etc. We all sometimes need reminders of the support that's already available to us, and conversation on how to better access this support. Finally, I can't recommend enough the importance of being comfortable with one's own grief, especially if you're trying to coach, counsel, or support others grappling with significant adversity and loss. I know now the importance of having a language and framework for understanding the various manifestations of grief, for knowing how to recognize denial and bargaining and anger, and be familiar with the eventual process of finding a very self-directed sense of meaning. But even beyond that, it's helpful to have consciously grappled with one's own history of loss, whether through therapy, writing, ritual, or art. What this does is carves out a holding space, an increased capacity to really meet others in the midst of their challenge. And that is a true gift to clients, not to mention to one's own friends, family, and self.
In a similar vein to the previous question, do you think having a background in mental health care was of any value, support, or advantage to you versus you being not of that particular background or training? In other words, were you able to have a perspectival advantage as someone who is trained to assist persons dealing with impactful and otherwise life-altering experiences such as yours?
I'm sure having professional training in mental health helped in ways I'm not aware of. I do know I benefited from my training indirectly, since most of my friends, colleagues, and mentors are also therapists who know how to listen without giving advice, and hold space with empathy. Heck, even John is a therapist. This has been invaluable. Most people who receive a terrible diagnosis are not so fortunate, and can end up abandoned, or at least misunderstood, by their support systems who may have less experience handling grief and misfortune in a skillful way. Nonetheless, my situation is a great example of the limits of one's own theoretical knowledge. Even though I could have named the stages of grief, knew how to identify compensatory behavior in the face of trauma, and knew what a negative prognosis nocebo was as compared to a placebo, for example, this doesn't mean this information was useful in the face of my new reality, and especially not in the beginning. When you're going through a really difficult challenge, and especially a challenge as threatening and traumatizing as a recent terminal diagnosis, head knowledge doesn't always help. You're not really operating out of the part of the brain which retrieves complex, abstract information. I found I first needed to be met on, and tend to, the emotional level, the heart level. Along these lines, what was helpful to me was the prior practice I had of learning how to surf the waves of my own distress. In contrast to theoretical knowledge, I'm talking experiential knowledge. I had already stored a lot of resilience in my emotional piggy bank, so to speak, through a history of my own therapy, and meditation practice, and recovery work. They taught me how to locate my internal resources, and how to better find my equilibrium once knocked about by stressful circumstances. I had practice in finding the willingness to ask for and receive help, noticing if I was adding to my own misery, and turning to simple tools of self-care when I'm feeling overwhelmed. Further, having the support systems these activities provided already in place was priceless, since it meant I had the kind of support I most needed when things really fell apart. I didn't do it perfectly, but at least I had some templates and tools already in place. The point I'm trying to get at here, the good news is, no, you don't have to be a therapist to know how to survive a terrible ordeal. But it really helps to make a practice of tending to your emotional hygiene as much as possible, before you're in a crisis. So many modern people worry so much about diet and exercise, but if we devote half as much attention to developing tools of resilience and inner flexibility and perspective building, we'll be in a much better position to handle life on life's terms when the impossible happens.
And having done the ayahuasca ceremonies, and having found insights into the meta-ego or transcendent self's union with a greater reality, which brought peace of mind to your journey through the last few years, is this a process that you could pass on or suggest as a part of the end-of-life experience? The work of Rick Strassman supports what you discovered, and his work and the work of others seems to suggest that there is great comfort to be had in exploring, through psychedelics, the ultimate of existential questions.
This is a great question, Justin. I know there's great interest in entheogens now, especially among spiritual seekers. Before I get far into answering it, though, it feels responsible to acknowledge that psychedelics are not safe for everyone, and can be contraindicated with certain medical conditions. It's important for anyone interested in exploring this realm to consult with qualified health professionals and do some research before deciding if it's an appropriate therapy. They can carry risks for those of us with neurological symptoms, especially considering they temporarily alter brain chemistry to a significant degree. And at the very least, it's important to right-size our expectations for how much they could heal our various ailments. I learned firsthand they are not a miracle cure for every condition, despite some claims to the contrary. Having said that disclaimer, I'm so thankful for my experiences with the ritual ingestion of plant medicine during my journey with illness. My experiences have so far been consistently positive, and occasionally life-changing and profound, some of which I share in the book. There's two levels on which I could address this question on the utility of plant medicine, especially for those of us facing serious or terminal illness. One is its potential function as a palliative medicine. As opposed to curative medicine which seeks to halt or reverse a disease process, palliative interventions are designed to produce comfort and care, or give life more meaning. In this way, ingesting psychedelics may allow us to access comforting insights and perspectives about our lives, or the dying process, or the afterlife. For example, while using ayahuasca, I was shown in various ways how consciousness survives physical death. I found this enormously relieving, as I'm sure most people with serious illness would. Prior to that point, my belief in the continuity of consciousness was simply a belief. But ayahuasca turned it into an embodied knowing. Additionally, in the past 2 years I've used psilocybin a few times at home, which has consistently aerated my outlook on my physical predicament towards something more inspired, creative, and hopeful. One of those times in particular really knocked me out of a depressive funk I was struggling to shake otherwise, and to this day I've felt quite stable emotionally. The second way these interventions may help could be on a more curative level, at least if we're applying the term curative quite broadly. The medicine has given me insights about the nature of my illness, some of which were quite practical. For example, I've been shown which relationship patterns are problematic for me and my health, what foods I need more or less of, and where there were energetic and physical tangles in my body that I could address. Suddenly I had more information to work with, although in each case it remained up to me whether or not to incorporate it into lifestyle changes. For these reasons, I believe psychedelics could be beneficial for many people with chronic illness, but only if they have a good container, guidance, and ideally, a safe ritual context to hold it. Usually when you hear about people having quote, bad trips, it's because their environment or companions did not feel safe, or grounded, or they carried fear or doubts about the medicine. The ritual context is key. For this reason, I wouldn't usually recommend people doing it on their own, especially for anyone not already experienced with these substances, or for someone with compromised health. This is powerful medicine and the whole experience deserves respect, consent, and thoughtfulness. Fortunately, there's a rapidly growing discipline of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to support people, and growing medical knowledge and literature supporting the benefits for people with terminal illnesses. I suggest anyone interested do more research. Maps.org is a nice place to start.
You lay out a pretty good case for the phenomena of persons dealing with chronic illness throwing everything they can at a condition in hopes of defeating the condition. Have you found a resource online or otherwise that helps people navigate that landscape without pouring unnecessary time, effort, and money into alternative treatments and complementary or integrative medicine? Likewise, you mentioned organizations that allegedly support or advocating for persons in situations like yours, but may come up short with regard to ethics. Specifically regarding ALS, do you have any tips or sage advice to offer folks who may come to this interview that is advice beyond that which was given in your book?
Yes. Thank you for asking this. The first thing worth acknowledging about getting a scary diagnosis is that you don't have time to panic. When modern medicine has literally nothing to offer you, it's tempting to try all sorts of miracle cures. But in our scramble to accomplish the impossible and heal ourselves, we may make a lot of exhausting, expensive, and avoidable mistakes. I know this because, as you know from reading my book, I tried nearly everything, and wore my husband and myself out in the process. Here's what I wish I would have done differently on my healing journey. 1. I wish I would have worked to accept the gravity of my prognosis earlier. As far as the stages of grief go, I was spinning in denial and bargaining for a long time. I was so adamant about needing to change my fate, and so focused on the hustle of it, I barely had time to catch my breath. And it's hard to heal before you're willing to acknowledge and accept the sobering predicament of your current reality. Now, it's important to acknowledge that I was doing the best that I could, as is anyone newly facing a terrifying prognosis. No one wants to get a terminal diagnosis, whether or not it includes progressive paralysis. Of course I was stressed and afraid and wanted to change my fate. Who wouldn't be? But I believe that any time we avoid accepting certain realities, and don't slow down enough to integrate the grief and complete unworkability of our situation, we're missing something important. And while there can be wisdom in looking for a cure, even if it's a long shot, there's also wisdom in taking the time to pause long enough to breathe deeply into our hearts. We can then ask ourselves how we most need, and want, to respond. Otherwise we will miss the clues and necessary reflection for understanding where our life force may be out of alignment. The role of the psyche in illness is definitely not everything, as some New Agers like to assert, but it can't be fully ignored if we are trying to maximize our own survival. Beyond that, on a more practical level, I wish I would have tried half as many treatment protocols, for double the time and depth. This would have given me a more insightful glimpse into what was helping and what was not. As it was, I was in such a mad dash to try and fix myself that I tried too many interventions half-heartedly, without a great rationale backing it up. This approach was doomed to fail, even if I can look back now with tenderness at how desperate I became. But let's look at the bigger context here for my desperation, specific to the disease I carry. It's worth noting that ALS has been a diagnosable condition known to Western medicine for 150 years. It's not that uncommon, actually. The only reason it doesn't get that much publicity is because patients die so quickly from it that the numbers of people diagnosed with it, and still alive at any given point in time, are relatively low compared to big-name diseases. The fact that there are still barely any viable treatments to address it, or even reliably slow it down, is maddening to patients and their families. Partly this challenge is because there are many routes to the same diagnosis, with the only identified commonality being severe neuroinflammation. The other reason is because the disease has not been given much priority in terms of research and funding, and the major ALS advocacy body has not pulled their weight in trying to address this. Meanwhile, this disease presents an impossible burden on families, and in its late stages costs up to $200,000 a year to care for. It's an ugly and cruel condition. Right now I have a team of 3 caregivers for 24-hour care, for example, and I know they mostly get exhausted after a few hours of caring for me. And I'm a relatively simple case for late-stage ALS, as I don't have any fancy machines or gizmos keeping me humming, except for my computer and power chair. Fortunately, awareness of the disease is growing, and I believe within another 10 to 15 years there should be good treatment options available to patients to slow or even reverse the disease. Unfortunately, this isn't much help for people diagnosed until that point. But right now, patients and patient advocates are getting fierce and organized in their push to demand adequate treatments. I'm most excited by the advocacy work of IamALS.org. Since I was diagnosed, HealingALS.org just sprung up and is helping educate and connect patients and families who want to try and self-treat. This is important because prior to this, there was no inherited knowledge base regarding which DIY treatments and interventions actually help people with ALS. Dr. Richard Bedlack, a neurologist at Duke, runs a research effort and website called ALS Untangled to try and help patients make more informed decisions about DIY treatments. I am now in the process of adding these to the resource page of my website. But while I applaud all the advocacy work of those fighting for better options for prevention and DIY care, my background leads me toward different aims. I'm most interested in attempting to bridge the emotional gap for people with devastating diseases. I want to know, how do we meet them where they are at? How do we help them hold the incredible squeeze of their predicament while mustering enough resilience and heart to stay present? To me, these are questions of timeless importance, and applicable to any number of human challenges. Even when a cure for ALS is found, these questions are still relevant.
I will note that your book is not only a biographical essay on your harrowing 30-something journey, but it is one of the most sane and pragmatic self-help and transformation books I have opened in my life. I've read quite a few titles in the last 30 years, too. You have no motives or programs or profit-making schemes, just a thoughtful purveyance of matters relating to the psyche, spirit, mental health, and overall relative well-being of any person who can find salience and wisdom in your book and in your work. Without sounding trite, I'm willing to predict that those who read your book will note the sincerity of this work and will benefit from the honest and unguru or anti-guru pearls of wisdom. This is less of a question, but I invite you to offer the viewers a waxing philosophical moment, if you will, to offer what it is you wish for the reader to take away from your overall intention in writing this book.
Thank you for saying that, Justin. That's quite a big compliment. I believe one of my aims in writing this is to really normalize the human side of the human journey. It's easy for those of us who fancy ourselves as spiritual to become quite ungrounded and unrealistic in our ambitions to actualize. So many of us, I believe, want to be special, so we go searching for the guru or practice or discipline or community or knowledge to complete us. Sometimes we hope to achieve some kind of special status. But if we look closely at this aspiration, we can see it's interwoven with the belief that our imperfection, our perpetual incompleteness, our humanness, is not enough. I believe this can arise out of unmet developmental needs, where we haven't yet metabolized enough unconditional love at the rate we needed to trust we are already enough in our sacred ordinariness. So we go searching out there, and then when we meet misfortune, like from a life-threatening diagnosis for example, it's easy to associate it with personal failure. Unfortunately, there are widely embraced narratives in popular culture, and especially among those of us interested in spirituality and alternative healing, that we create our realities. Nowhere is this more poignant than in matters of health and illness. I think while this idea motivates some people to make positive change by taking responsibility for their lives, it also runs the risk of encouraging self-blame and shame for the existence of the illness, or one's inability to reverse it. And that is not helpful, or healing. Because many doctors consider ALS to be one of the very worst diagnoses anyone can receive, and it was only one of a handful of big losses John and I survived in the past few years, I wanted to take the opportunity to illustrate firsthand how we can find our way through even the most harrowing circumstances. It's as if my illness affords me a strange experiential authority, so I felt compelled to use it to craft my own gentle manifesto of common sense support for people facing mortality, which, of course, is ultimately all of us. I wanted to say, hey, this being human thing is fucked up, and beautiful, and isn't it amazing that no one really knows how to do it? And yet we're all finding ways day after day to do it somehow, even in impossible circumstances, and we should take a moment now and then to celebrate how impressive that is. Even though we don't create our objective reality, we always have choices for how we respond to what happens to us, and how much courage and heart we muster in how we navigate it all. If that's not a powerful way to manifest, then I don't know what is. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you like this, Justin. Thank you for featuring us on your new podcast. It's been especially fun to include John in this conversation. And I wish you the best of luck with the Illumine Life offering. I'm sure it will be good medicine for anyone hungry for inspiration.
Thank you very much, Terry. And I'm deeply grateful that you engaged with me in this dialogue, in this conversation. And I am just really pleased with the conversation that we have. And I'm also glad that John is going to be a part of this. John Wagner will be coming up next in a recorded but in real time dialogue. And we will get to that next. And again, Terry, thank you so much. Much love to you for the book, for joining me, and I have to say now you're part of the Illumine Life community, and that just makes that community all the better, all the richer. So again, thank you so much.
Computer option. Okay. So I can hit, and we're going. And welcome to part 2 of the Teri Dillion No Pressure, No Diamonds interview. And I have Terry with me, and I also have John Wagner with me. And this will be the second dialogue or interview, and I will be asking John some questions. But first, I would like to ask John to give us a little bit of background and introduce himself. So, John.
Sure, Justin. Thanks for having both of us. Yes, I'm a psychotherapist here in Colorado, and I've been a psychotherapist for about 10 years now, and in the mental health profession for about 15 years. I live here in Colorado with Terry and 2 cats, and currently her mom, who's part of our household and also part of the care team currently. And that's thanks to her, the care team has been filled out a little bit, and it's actually super helpful.
Oh, I can certainly imagine. So one of the questions I had for you, John, is a similar question that I had asked Terry, and that's with regard to your being a therapist. And I think you would have some insight into this experience and phenomena. And so would you care to speak to that and maybe share some of your acquired sage from this experience?
Yeah, so I think, of course, my point of view includes being a psychotherapist, but also Terry's husband and partner. And I think it applies to anybody who's caring for someone with illness of any sort. And I would also include that about ourselves. Caring for ourselves, which of course is a super important thing for all of us at any time, and maybe especially now in our current situation as human beings. But one way that people talk about, sort of, we have these foundations of well-being, right? And often the ones that get the biggest airplay are sleep, diet, and exercise. But in the world of psychotherapy, often social connections is included in that, and I think that's important. And someone I've studied with in the realm of psychotherapy, Diane Poole Heller, likes to call our social connections a healing tribe. That we're really built, evolutionarily speaking, culturally speaking, to have a healing tribe, to have a tribe of close people around us. And I think that's a crucial part of being well as a person. And of course, that can include does include living people. So, for instance, I'm a part of Terry's healing tribe, but of course, she's a part of my healing tribe too. And so I think living people is included in that. Also, maybe people who are no longer living, so ancestors, whether they're our own family members or just the ancestors in the human realm. But also can include maybe what I would call non-human beings or entities, so places and animals, trees and plants, and it can be really anything. It could be archetypal figures, people who entities who sort of are protectors or nourishers. We could go into a whole sort of Jungian sort of archetypal conversation there. But the healing tribe is really necessary. We're built for social connections and we need them. And, chronic illness, chronic situations tend to erode those connections. And living in a pandemic for many of us has been trying in terms of our social connections. Aloneness and loneliness are not healthy, to be sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know beyond the tribal aspect, I'll ask you, both in your particular case and perhaps in a more broader sense, I know a lot of the 19th century philosophers appealed to aestheticism and the philosophy of aestheticism, which is essentially appreciation of the arts and perhaps good literature and music and so forth. And so in both your personal experience and what you are going through, and I know it was mentioned in Teri's book that there were some movies and things that you enjoyed, but I would imagine that's good medicine. And is that something that could be considered part of the routine?
For sure.
To elevate.
I think, of course, literature and movies and visual art and music, those are all ways in which we express ourselves as human beings, and people have expressed themselves for thousands and thousands of years from the very beginning. It's, I think, a way of getting at who and what we are and how we're experiencing things and connecting to, I think that could be considered part of a healing tribe is, I've read lots of good books when I've had moments when I have free time. That is, because I don't have a whole lot of free time necessarily these days, but, reading C.S. Lewis, A Grief Observed, about the illness and the death of his wife has been important. I've read a number of memoirs of partners whose partners were ill and died, and that's been really meaningful. I think that's a part of it, right, is finding meaning. Human beings, of course, are meaning-making beings. We can't help it.
Right.
And that's such a wonderful way that we are as beings, as making meaning and reading about and watching movies and seeing what meaning people make. Because honestly, facing chronic illness and facing a terminal illness, of course, we're all in that, right? We're all living on borrowed time, is finding meaning and reconstructing meaning or finding new meaning when the meaning seems to have been unraveled is super important. Otherwise we get demoralized and can just shut down.
Kind of like what Viktor Frankl says about if you can find something to believe in while you're under the greatest of worst of conditions, I should say, that if meaning making is possible, then you can get through just about everything.
He was a genius.
Right.
At finding meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would recommend people checking into his work if they're coming to this video and they're searching for means of, I don't want to say catharsis, but processing grief. And so I'll interject here in this moment that I have some background noise, and I apologize to those who are listening to the video. There's going to be intermittent chainsaw noise, and I do apologize for that. So going to one thing that was brought up by you earlier when you were first speaking was the tribal aspect of keeping sort of social norms and connections going. For people who are the caregivers and working with someone, is there a resource or is there a safe way or a quick way to sort of know what your boundaries are in terms of, let's say, the caregiver checking in with themselves to make sure that they are not depleting themselves, or so again, you're equipped with the tools of a therapist and a psychotherapist, but so someone on the street like myself with no academic background and thrust into something, is there any bits of advice or places you could direct people that they would be able to deal with crisis or again ongoing conditions of caring for someone, where they can find that balance, maybe where they can go and detach temporarily from being the role of the caregiver?
Yeah, well, I think that's partly where the healing tribe comes in, is that the people around them, the caregiver, right? People around them can serve as kind of mirrors and reflect what they see and hear and inquire into, how that person is doing. I'll tell you just a little anecdotal story because it just happened, but it's something that's happened frequently, and it's not a problem per se, but it is something to note. I was just out at an appointment earlier, and I ran into somebody that Teri and I know, and of course, the first thing the person asked was, "How's Teri?" And it's a good idea for people to recognize that, of course, it's useful to ask about Teri, and people want to know about Teri and how she's doing, and they don't want to bother her and sort of intrude, right? So they tend to have really good boundaries around Teri, but they don't really think, I think, sometimes that they're forgetting to ask about me, and that they're sort of intruding on a boundary that I might have, which is like, well, why don't you just ask her? She's available. You could ask her.
Accessible. Yeah.
Right. So that's a little bit of a tangent, but I think for people who are either choosing or thrust into the caregiver role, having a healing tribe who can take on a little bit of that. I think it's a little bit like a holding environment. They're being held by other people who can really ask about how they're doing, ask about, oh, I'm noticing that you look tired these days. I wonder how how are you feeling, and are you taking care of yourself? Because we can't always do it ourselves. We're not actually designed to do it ourselves entirely, contrary to our post-Enlightenment culture.
Right, that libertarian sense of
so yeah, that we're just supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and
right.
Even the image imagines that we have boots. So we may not have our boots on anymore.
Right.
And how are we going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps if we don't have boots on?
Yeah, ask Munchausen. Maybe he'll know. So I'm going to just play the worst case, or not the greatest case scenario. And again, apologies for background noise. If someone is, again, thrust into a situation, a diagnosis, or let's say even a tragic accident, and somebody, a partner is left disabled, do you know if there are volunteer support groups? Or so in other words, the tribe can be constructed external of what would be the normal social network, or the social in the group, the small group of family and friends of that person. So if perhaps they were isolated more or less to begin with, do you know if there's anything of that nature?
Well, I think there are. One thing to think about in terms of that, I think, is the first thing I think about is, every disease, especially the ones that are more common, ones that are very uncommon don't have this, of course, has a kind of association or support group out there. So like with ALS, there's the ALS Association that is a resource, and they sometimes have access to to support groups for caregivers. I think hospitals, hospitals that have oncology centers, different centers of disease, cardiac sort of centers where hospitals do work. They work with families. So, consulting those. Social workers in terms of mental health professionals, in terms of therapists, often are best trained in that kind of realm. So seeking out a therapist or a social worker who has that kind of macro lens is super helpful. Getting a therapist is always of course, I'm a psychotherapist, so I always think that's a possible route to seek help. I'll just say that I think for me personally, as an individual person, that's been a stretch for me. Even though I'm a psychotherapist and I know all of the right things that people might do, I think asking for help is a hard thing for many of us to do. It's a hard thing for me to do. Some of us are better at asking for help than others, and some of us are better at receiving help even when the help is there at others. And I have to say, I have to admit or confess that I'm not very good at asking for help, and I'm not always very good at receiving help. And that's something I've really learned. This situation and my relationship with Teri has not really afforded me the conditions in which I can just go along my merry way and live in my adaptations. I've had to stretch out. I've been stretched out, not through any, virtue of my own. I've been stretched out and been forced into finding new ways to be. And Teri's making a comment here that she says, "But I'm getting better."
Yeah. Yes.
Progress, not perfection, as some people say. Right,
exactly. And so that, I guess there are a couple of possible reasons why we, and I kind of do the same thing, are reluctant to seek help. Part of it, I guess, goes back to, like you said, post-enlightenment sense of, manifest destiny and individualism and all that jazz. And then also, I guess, just worthiness, or I don't, you would certainly be able to speak to that and do it more justice, but it's almost a psychological barrier that you feel weak perhaps, or vulnerable if you're asking for help.
Yeah, I think you're onto it. Yeah, I think that's worthiness is a theme that I certainly hear often from the people I work with professionally. It resonates with me. I think it goes back to, our early primary relationships with our caregivers. Many of us, seem to have a kind of implicit narrative, right? That it's like, I'll only be cared for if I do the right things. Not just simply because I am, that I just deserve it because I'm here in the human body. That I have to do something, that it's conditional, right? And that gets set up very early, I think, for people.
True.
And Teri's making another comment that I think is really relevant and important, that it's maybe harder for men in our culture. Maybe not all cultures, but in our culture, it's harder for men. We have gender sanctioned, culturally sanctioned, gender specific emotions that are more accessible and more appropriate, so to speak, like anger, rather than sadness and disappointment and hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. I like to joke that a man's greatest weakness is his fear of being perceived as being weak. So
I think
it's this sort of circle of self. Yeah, the self-defeating.
The shadow elements of our character and of our culture.
Absolutely. And again, I apologize for the background noise. Would you like to speak to, there was a question I had for Teri regarding in the early stages of menacious or pernicious disease diagnosis, where we tend to throw everything we can at the disease and the problem. And I had a chronic illness about 10 or 11 years ago, and I kind of went through the same thing. I was, all the integrative medicine and energy stuff and this and that. And do you have anything you want to lend to that as well? Anything you want to speak to that? Any caveats, or perhaps just sage?
Well, yeah, it's I mean, I know from my own experience, and I know from friends and family members and people I've worked with. I think it's so natural. There's a life force that we have, survival drives and instincts that we want to live, and we're not going to give up so easily. And so I think it's totally natural and kind of, I don't want to be too, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish, but I think it's sort of brilliant and beautiful that we want to live and that we're willing to do so many things. And I don't think until we're pushed into the corner, so to speak, I'm not sure that we really know how much we want to live, and for what reasons, what those meanings are that we want to live. So I think there's something there. Of course, if we're desperately in survival modes, in survival states, it's nigh on impossible to be reflecting on much more, as I think you probably know from your own experience.
Right.
And we're not really designed to be in survival states for very long. So it's really hard on the body, right? It's hard on our biological, our animal body. It suffers under the conditions of being in survival states. And we know quite a bit about that from stress studies and chronic stress studies. We know that that's really damaging to the body. So we can be doing all the right things, but not finding the healing because we're sort of undoing it by being in survival states.
Right. And on a similar note, and this is straying off the topic, the centrality of the topic a little bit, but I think it might be interesting to get your input, is, and this is just a thought of mine, that we've been around as this sort of sapient being for maybe 150, 200,000 years with these cortical capacities. And save for the last 3 generations, we've spent that time surviving and struggling and killing and dying and living in rather hardscrabble conditions. And it almost seems like that hitting the brakes on what seems to be a very reasonable and inborn faculty or instinct, etc. In this modern era where we do have comfort and convenience and we don't have to kill or be killed or destroy the other tribe or do any of these other things to survive, but it's like, again, hitting the brakes on that. What do you, am I just off in abstract land? I mean, does it make sense that for 300-400 generations or of again, maybe settled, like the last 15-20,000 years and settled life, that as humans, in other words, it's hard to shake that survival pattern. You could get a little more abstract and think about it in either a genetic sense, or you could even get more abstract and think about it in sort of the consciousness sense. But for whatever elements are at play, or modes or aspects are at play, it seems like we are in that period where we have set ourselves up just in the last maybe 120, 30 years, most of us anyway, first world. Does that sort of play into the, as you were speaking to stress and are sort of trapped in modes of stress in modern living?
It's a really good question, and I don't know that I have really much to say or answers about it for sure. I don't have any answers. I do wonder. I mean, I don't know, right? Like, I don't know what it was like to be living 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago or 50,000 years ago. It might have been that, they came out of survival states. Maybe they came out of survival states faster than we do because they had to. And when they were cozied up in their cave with their tribe, that they felt quite held and safe. And they were back into social engagement. I mean, I think we're built for that. So I don't really know what it was like. Teri has a really good comment that she's guessing that and not sure whether stresses are actually less now. And I think that's a good thing to think about too. We've sort of set up conditions in which at least some of us who are alive now actually have a tremendous amount of abundance, relatively speaking. So we don't have to think so much about the survival things. But then we've built these other conditions, right? Like highways and cars and airplanes and
modernity,
information that we can access, 24/7 that inundates us and is exceedingly stressful.
Plus, we simulate it in media and entertainment. There's just about every video game is survival. It's killing and surviving. So it just kind of speaks to the psyche that we have, and perhaps even genetically that. So again, it was just an off-the-wall question since you brought up survival, and I've always sort of tossed that around as an idea. But it'd be interesting if there was anything.
There is a cost. I will say too. I think it's an interesting reflection, and there's a cost at being separated from our survival states too. People who get disconnected from their survival states often find themselves in danger because they're not sensing where the danger is. So we need those survival states. There's nothing higher about social engagement than survival. We need survival states too, to know where the danger is and to know how to respond to it.
Right.
And people who aren't connected to fight, flight, freeze, seeking, all of those survival states are in trouble.
Yeah, making sound judgments, whether you're in an urban environment or you're out in the woods somewhere, you have to still have those innate capabilities to
and
see
whether
what's
people
coming
are
up.
safe, whether the people around us are safe to be in relationship with.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's important to be afraid of COVID, Teri says. Yeah, it's a right. Making sense of a threat, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well said.
Well, I appreciate your input on that. Like I said, it's just some abstract idea I tossed around, but you were talking about survival, and I thought, well, let me throw that out there. So, all right. Was there anything else you wanted to speak to, John, relating to either the book or something that you all are feeling like needs to come out to help round out this conversation?
Well, I certainly would be interested if Teri has any comments. I'll just say that I think one of the, and I was thinking of this theme in Teri's book as the chainsaw noise was coming on, that it's a good example of the theme in Teri's book of untidying. And that's been such a helpful, I love the language that she used around that and the theme of untidying, that we get put in these conditions in our lives. I think it happens to all of us in some way eventually, where our usual ideas, our usual approach, our usual strategies, our usual adaptations just aren't the right ones. They don't fit. And of course, we keep trying those old strategies and adaptations until we really get it. And I think untidying as a theme really gets at that we get unraveled by extreme, intense situations, chronic illness and terminal illness being one of them, that we're invited to be made bigger.
Have a new dynamic on board, new perspective.
New ways of new meanings, as we were talking about before, new adaptations, new capacities that we find. I guess for me, I have found in myself, I think, and developed in myself capacities I never knew I had.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't trade that for anything. Right?
No, no.
Terry's saying, and life never tires of sending us opportunities to practice.
Right?
So, yeah, the universe, whatever we think of as whatever's out there, bigger than us.
Yeah.
The thing that's not just me and my little bubble is inviting me maybe to be practicing something, to maybe just practicing being human.
Right.
Is a thing.
Right. Yeah. I've recently read a book that was a sort of treatise of the work of Arthur Schopenhauer, and he has a line, and I'll butcher it, but it's sort of basically all eyes looking into the world, and so sort of the metabolizing agents, all consciousness, all that is alive is experiential, and it is taking in information. And if you again, you allude to the universe or consciousness, and perhaps even thinking about teleology or purpose, that when we go through things that seem trying or traumatic and so forth, that maybe there is a co-creative process going on, and I'm not trying to sort of point to anything in particular, but again, with just keeping consciousness in mind, and if there's consciousness beyond our coils here, these bodies that we occupy, then that really helps to bring some sense making into what we go through, the experience, both happiness and trauma. And going back to Schopenhauer, he was of the mind that suffering is the normative. Suffering is part and parcel of existence. Happiness is sort of this thing we pursue, and it's it's acquired temporarily, but it is that you're more or less striving to diminish suffering. But he was also very much into Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism and so forth, and so he took that perspective of less resistance and more just a co-creative way of approaching anything that passes by or passes to you in life experience and so forth. But that gives me some comfort sometimes that it's not all about me, maybe perhaps, or us, that this is happening, and we are. I always like to think that we're just little neurons reporting back to something else that might be
to some bigger,
or little bits of sense.
System.
Yeah.
We're a complex system embedded in a much bigger complex system.
Exactly.
Might actually be, Terry and I have talked about this idea, and other people have explored this, and maybe have much more experience, that the universe somehow might need us to be experiencing so that it knows it broadens its consciousness into experience, and
right.
we're here doing it in these sort of small human bodies, and not specially. I don't think humans are special that way, but that the universe is experiencing itself
right
through life,
right,
and through the universe, and how it's manifesting, and that's kind of a mind-blowing and yet comforting idea to me.
It really is, because again, it goes back, and I won't go so far as to say there's a universal telos or a teleology or a purpose, but the purpose is found in us. And so I like to reduce telos or purpose back down to us, these individual units, packets having experience, and to bring Schopenhauer back into the conversation, he calls it the will and the representation. I think that was one of his books. And so the will is the sort of transpersonal consciousness or the universe, and the representation is us, these beings. And the will is blindly seeking that telos or that purpose, perhaps. And so it's, I'm sure there's good conversations to be had how something transpersonal and purely instinctual can then sort of manifest itself as something that is self-authoring and self-aware, but nonetheless, it's a beautiful way to try to again sense make the existence of us and persons and so forth. And again, in times when we're thinking about mortality or grievous illness, I think that in some way, and some people may not be able to think of it this way, but it's comforting to know that too, that you're part of a larger experience. And there's a guy, Peter Fenwick, who goes really, really far into that, and he's really into NDE research and things like that. And he is good in a sense that he offers this sort of therapy of comfort for folks that are terminal, and he's spent decades compiling essentially anecdotal evidence, but supportive of people who've come back to say that, you know, that consciousness seems to transcend these things that we go around in. So, and again, I say all that with an agnostic tone, but at the same time, a hopeful tone that that transpersonal consciousness is benefiting from what we work through here and experience.
Yeah.
So, and Teri says, yeah. So, and like I said, Teri, maybe we can have another conversation, and we can begin with things that you and I had talked about, and then maybe we could drift, the three of us could maybe build on some more of that kind of thinking, because I think that would be really neat. So John, I was mentioning to Teri, and I can't remember if you were present when we were talking about that, but having a second conversation, and
yeah.
it essentially started with in paying attention to Teri's writing on social media as well as her book. There have been conclusions drawn about things like spiritual bypassing and what I call celestial conspiracies, and sort of overbuilding, over-constructing, and the apprehension of things that may not be necessarily healthy. So that would be a good conversation to do a part 2 sometime in the near future. But again, also maybe going into some speculation about consciousness itself. I think that would be a fun conversation. So, all right. And as John said, Teri, if you had anything else that you wanted to throw in the form of, yeah, it would be a good conversation. And John, likewise, if you wanted to help bring this to a beautiful close with any other thoughts. Okay,
No,
nothing else.
I don't think I have anything else. I just, you know, I appreciate your questions and the invitation, and you know, hope that there's some benefit found in my experience and thoughts about the experience from my side.
I think it will, John, because each interview I do is going to attract a different audience, but I think there will be a greater dynamic in this audience that comes to this video, because and of course I can help that along with tags and so forth, but I think as it grows spontaneous, or it is exposed spontaneously, that there will be people specifically for ALS issues, there will be people specifically for chronic illness issues, people who have made themselves familiar with Teri's book and its contents. And then also, I think there's just a broader conversation going on, both in the interview that was pre-recorded that Teri and I did, and what we just did here about making sense and meaning, and again, a purpose for what we all experience. And so hopefully there'll be a number of reasons why folks come here. There'll be other people that I interview down the road, and there'll be sort of a more narrow band of conversations.
Yeah.
There's
well, thanks for building the platform and building your, you know, this sort of channel that you're exploring. And thanks for offering us time to speak with you.
Absolutely, John. And I'm very grateful that the two of you were able to jump on this call with me. And it's awesome to see Teri. It's awesome to see you. As I was saying to Teri, it's been 2 years since we saw each other in person. So it's amazing how time goes by. And I really believe in the book that Teri wrote. I think, as I said, both in my Amazon review and in the preamble to this, that I think this book covers, just kind of like a repeat of what I just said, it covers a lot of bases. It talks about chronic illness and trauma, the trauma of dealing with that. And I had a small taste of that in my own life, so I can empathize with that, because it was not a pleasant experience. And but I'm still carrying on. And Yeah, I am, and I'm grateful for that too. But it also speaks to things just beyond that, and it's just a very beautiful story. And so that's the other thing I hope that comes from this video is that people will see this video if they haven't purchased the book. I strongly encourage them to do that. They can go to the Amazon page where Teri's book, No Pressure, No Diamonds is. You can read the synopsis and reviews like the one I wrote, and there's some really good reviews on there. So, all right. Well, again, thank you both so very much. It was a pleasure having you. I'm grateful to have had this conversation with both you, and I will try to get it uploaded either today or perhaps tomorrow. And I'm also going to have a coming out party on my Facebook group and let people know that this video will be uploaded. Nobody knows that I'm doing this on my Facebook page, so there's a bunch of people there. So yeah, so we might get some immediate response to that. So, and you guys feel free, tag away, promote, you know how it goes, just splash it all over social media and we'll see what happens. So,
Yeah.
and anyway, and Teri, it's great to see you again. I'm so glad we could connect on Zoom. And so we'll speak behind the scenes and perhaps we'll let this video have a little time for maturation, and then we'll maybe do a part 2 and we'll come up with some content for that. Some things to talk about. So yes, she says great with an exclamation point. So that's awesome. All right, guys. Oh, and I have to acknowledge this wasn't on camera before, but I've had my producer here with me. Oh, you see, they're getting the heart on the cat there now. So when she sits a certain way, her spots line up to make a heart. So so I've had the cat here the whole time helping me out. So. All right, guys, thank you again very much. This was a beautiful interview. I'm going to hit pause on the record, and then we'll have some time to say goodbye off camera. So, but for the sake of this video, thank you very much, and we'll do a part 2 down the road.